In 1997, the quiet town of Stirling, Scotland, erupted in chaos. Hundreds gathered on the Raploch estate, shouting for justice, for protection, for revenge. At the center of the storm stood a woman everyone knew, Margaret Haney, better known as Big Mags. With her bleached hair, cigarette in hand, and a child's karaoke mic, she shouted commands that silenced the crowd and sent fear through the streets. Within hours, a convicted pedophile was driven out of town. The newspapers hailed her as a hero, a grandmother who stood up when no one else would. To many, she was the voice of the people, fearless, loud, unstoppable. But that was only half the story. Behind the headlines and the fury was another truth. The same woman leading a crusade for justice was running a hidden empire of drugs, fear, and control. This is the story of Margaret Big Mags Haney, Scotland's self-made vigilante who became its most dangerous criminal matriarch. Margaret Haney was born in the early 1940s in a Scotland still struggling with poverty, unemployment, and the slow collapse of traditional industry. For families like hers, survival meant adapting to hardship, and hardship often bred anger. By the time the 1980s arrived, Margaret was living in Stirling's Raploch estate, an area that had become a symbol of everything Britain wanted to ignore. Streets were worn down, jobs were gone, and drugs were quietly replacing hope. Inside a cramped council house, she raised 13 children. It was a life filled with shouting, chaos, and constant conflict with the authorities. Many of her children would end up in prison, but to Margaret, that wasn't failure. It was the price of survival. She often said her family had been born into hell, blaming a broken system that left people like her with no chance to rise. Her anger, however, wasn't quiet. She became known to local police long before she ever made headlines. Arrests for assault, fraud, and breach of the peace marked her early years. Yet to many in Raploch, she wasn't just a troublemaker. She was a woman who demanded attention in a world that ignored people like her. By the time the tabloids found her, Big Mags had already built her reputation. She had learned that in a place where fear replaced respect, control meant power. In Raploch, she became both a protector and a threat, someone who could comfort a neighbor one moment and terrify them the next. For Margaret Haney, control wasn't just about authority. It was survival, and it would become the foundation of everything she built, both her fame and her downfall. By the early 1990s, life in Raploch had become a daily struggle. It wasn't just poverty, it was a slow collapse of order. Families locked their doors before sunset. Drug use had taken root in every corner of the estate, and theft was so common that people stopped reporting it. Police presence grew weaker with time. Some officers admitted they avoided certain blocks altogether. Everyone knew who held real influence in those streets, and it wasn't the law. Rumors traveled faster than sirens, and fear spread faster than justice. When word broke that a convicted pedophile had been moved into the area, the community snapped. Parents were terrified, and whispers quickly turned into shouts. Crowds formed outside the man's home, growing larger each night. The police tried to control it, but no one was listening to them anymore. And at the front of that chaos stood Margaret Haney. She didn't wait for permission or authority. She grabbed a child's karaoke microphone, stood before hundreds of angry neighbors, and declared that Raploch would not be a dumping ground for criminals. Her voice carried power, raw and commanding. She urged people to take their streets back, to defend their children when the system had failed them. In that moment, Margaret Haney stopped being just another angry local. She became Big Mags. The scene was pure defiance, a grandmother standing up to what the public saw as a broken justice system. Cameras captured every second. Newspapers printed her name in bold headlines, "Granny leads vigilante mob." Some called her a hero who spoke for the forgotten. Others warned she was dangerous, that she had turned frustration into lawlessness. But Britain was watching. fascinated by the image of a woman challenging authority in the name of community protection. Big Mags quickly embraced the attention. Interviews followed, and journalists swarmed Raploch, eager to meet this fearless woman. She spoke openly about what she called the government's betrayal of working-class estates, how poverty had turned good people into addicts, and neglect had turned neighbors into enemies. Her words struck a nerve with those who felt left behind by politics and policy. She wasn't polished or polite, but she was honest, and people listened. Yet beneath the surface, there was another truth that few could see. Mag's rise wasn't just about moral outrage, it was about control. The same energy she used to unite people against one kind of evil was already feeding something far darker. The drug trade that haunted Raploch was not a distant problem, it was thriving in her own circle. Her public image as a protector hid the growing empire her family was building. As she condemned pedophiles and outsiders, her relatives were moving heroin through the same streets she claimed to defend. Local residents whispered about it, but rarely spoke openly. Fear kept them quiet. No one wanted to cross the Haneys. The irony was bitter. Big Mags had become the face of justice for a neglected community, yet her power depended on the very chaos she claimed to fight. Each headline, each TV appearance made her bolder, louder, and more untouchable. The media saw a fearless grandmother. The police saw a woman gathering an army of loyal supporters, and her own neighborhood saw both, protector and predator, side by side. By the time the crowd dispersed and the pedophile was driven out, Big Mag's name was carved into the public consciousness. Raploch had found its voice, but it wasn't a voice of peace, it was one of fury. And at the heart of it all stood a woman who had learned to turn anger into power. What began as a protest for safety had, without anyone realizing it, created a new kind of ruler, one who understood that fear, once awakened, could be controlled. This was only the beginning. The woman hailed as a hero of the people was already building her next legacy, a kingdom born not of justice, but of intimidation and control. By 1997, Margaret Haney was no longer just a name whispered around Raploch. She had become a national headline. Her expulsion of Alan Christie, a convicted child abuser, turned her from a local troublemaker into a symbol of raw justice. Britain was captivated. Newspapers couldn't get enough of her defiance, and television producers saw her as a voice for a nation angry at a justice system they no longer trusted. She appeared on daytime programs like Kilroy, where she spoke with unfiltered fury about the moral collapse of Britain. Sitting in a studio filled with gasps and applause, she pointed her finger at men she believed were hiding their crimes, calling them beasts in front of live audiences. People admired her courage. She said what others were too afraid to say, and for that, many called her a hero. The press loved the contrast. A grandmother with no wealth, no influence, yet somehow commanding a nation's attention. Headlines praised her as the granny who stood up for the people. For a short time, she truly believed she was leading a moral revolution. She began traveling to other estates, rallying crowds, shouting through loudspeakers, and declaring that communities had the right to defend themselves when the authorities failed them. But while her words stirred hope, her reality told another story. The same streets she vowed to protect were being poisoned by heroin, a trade deeply tied to her own family. The line between justice and hypocrisy blurred, and she was walking straight through the middle of it. For several months, Big Mags lived in two worlds, hero and outlaw, savior and supplier. Yet the same fame that lifted her up was quietly setting the stage for her fall. The story that built her power was about to expose her for what she truly was. The 1990s were the golden age of British moral outrage. Every week, tabloids and talk shows hunted for characters who embodied the country's anger, people who spoke the language of the street, who could shout what the public only dared to think. Big Mags fit that role perfectly. She was loud, blunt, and unapologetically working class. To the press, she wasn't just a woman from Stirling, she was the face of Britain's frustration. Journalists called her the people's granny, the fearless voice of a forgotten generation. She appeared on national television, her heavy accent cutting through the polished tones of London studios. On shows like Kilroy, she railed against paedophiles, drug dealers, and what she called a government that couldn't protect its own. She talked with conviction, never hesitating, never backing down. Audiences loved it. Producers loved it even more. Ratings rose whenever she appeared. Soon, documentaries followed. The BBC and Channel 5 both sent crews into Raploch, eager to capture the real voice of Scotland's struggle. They filmed her walking through the estate, children running behind her, neighbours calling her name. She became a living symbol of defiance, a one-woman crusade against moral collapse. But behind the camera, things were not as noble as they seemed. Residents of Raploch began writing letters to local newspapers, furious at how their lives were being rewritten. To them, Big Mags wasn't a savior. She was the source of their fear. Many accused her of using violence and intimidation to maintain control. Her family's influence stretched deep into the local drug trade, yet the media turned a blind eye. The woman portrayed as a working-class hero was, in their eyes, the very reason the estate was drowning. Still, the cameras kept rolling. The media had found its story and wasn't about to let it go. She was controversial, unpredictable, and endlessly quotable, everything that made for perfect television. And for Mags, fame became a drug of its own. She began to believe in the myth that journalists had built around her. Every interview, every headline, pushed her further from reality and deeper into her own legend. But cracks were already forming. As her fame grew, her enemies multiplied. Police investigations into local heroin distribution were quietly circling her family. Journalists began whispering about the inconsistencies in her story, about the irony of a so-called moral crusader profiting from the very poison destroying her community. Yet, in the eyes of the public, she was still the voice of the people. It wasn't until years later that the truth began to unravel. The BBC's The Ballad of Big Mags podcast exposed how the media had glamorized her without question. Former producers admitted that early warnings about her criminal ties were ignored. The story was too powerful, too entertaining, to risk losing. In chasing ratings, they had turned a local gangster into a folk legend. Television had made her, but it also destroyed her. Once the spotlight faded, the character she'd played, this fearless, justice-driven matriarch, collapsed under the weight of her real life. The applause stopped. The headlines moved on. What remained was the woman behind the myth, a dealer, an informant, and a mother presiding over a crumbling empire built on fear. Big Mags had always understood power. She learned how to take it from the streets, and later, how to wield it through the screen. But power built on lies doesn't last. The same media that once celebrated her would soon expose her. In the end, it wasn't the police or her rivals who brought her down. It was the story itself. The legend of Big Mags, born on television, would die there too. By the mid-1990s, the Haney name had become shorthand for chaos. In courtrooms across Scotland, it carried weight, not of respect, but of fear. Judges called them a one-family crime wave. Almost 40 relatives had faced prison sentences for everything from housebreaking and assault to fraud and theft. Their record wasn't a coincidence, it was a family business. At the center of it all stood Big Mags, proud, defiant, and utterly unashamed. When a sheriff once questioned her family's endless court appearances, she smirked and replied, "If it wasn't for my family, you'd all be out of a job." That single line captured everything about her, brazen, mocking, and convinced that the system existed to play against her. Her home in Raploch became known as Haney's Hotel. The name wasn't affectionate, it was a warning. Bars covered the windows, police visits were constant, and neighbors whispered her name with resentment. Yet within those walls, she held her family together like a matriarch defending her empire. To her, their crimes weren't evil, they were survival, proof that the world outside had failed them long before they failed it. But even fear has limits. The same community that once followed her lead began to turn. People were exhausted, tired of threats, thefts, and the never-ending drama surrounding her clan. In 1997, Raploch finally pushed back. Hundreds gathered outside her home, shouting for her to leave. This time, Big Mags wasn't the leader of the mob. She was its target. As police escorted her away, she raised her hand and gave the crowd her signature gesture. A middle finger in the air, a final act of defiance. For the first time, Big Mags Haney wasn't the voice of rebellion. She was its victim. After being driven out of Raploch, Big Mags refused to fade into obscurity. She moved to Lower Bridge Street in Stirling, telling anyone who'd listen that she wanted a quiet life. But beneath the calm surface, the same machinery kept turning. Behind her doors, Mags was rebuilding her operation. Only now it was cleaner, smarter, and far more profitable. Her network of dealers and runners stretched across the city, and by the late 1990s, her heroin trade was bringing in nearly £1,000 a day. Her influence was absolute. Fear still did the talking. Those who worked for her knew that loyalty wasn't a choice, it was survival. People who crossed her either vanished from the business or ended up with broken bones. Mags ruled with a mix of charm and menace, the same balance that once won her public sympathy. She believed she had outsmarted everyone, the police, the press, even her own community. But cracks began to show. Rumors started to circulate that the self-proclaimed protector of children was flooding their estates with drugs. At first, few dared to speak up, but anonymous whispers soon reached the ears of investigative journalists. One of them was Mark McGivern from the Daily Record. He began receiving detailed tips about Mag's operation, names, drop-off points, even descriptions of the cars used for delivery. McGivern didn't rely on hearsay. He went undercover, tracing her network from small-time users to mid-level dealers, all leading back to one address, Big Mag's own home. Eventually, he made contact with her associates and managed to buy heroin himself. The evidence was undeniable. When he finally confronted Mags face-to-face, she didn't flinch. Sitting in her living room, in a chair that looked more like a throne than a seat, she denied everything. Calm, confident, as if the walls around her were still hers to command. But the next morning, she woke up to the headline that shattered the illusion: Dealer Number 1. The story exposed her empire in full detail: names, profits, and methods. Scotland's former community crusader had been unmasked as a drug lord. The media that once celebrated her turned vicious, dissecting every word she'd ever spoken about morality and justice. Within days, police raids swept through Stirling. Her family homes were searched, doors kicked in, evidence seized. The myth of Big Mags, the fearless granny who stood up for her people, collapsed overnight. In 2001, she was arrested alongside several of her children and relatives. For years, she had manipulated the press, the courts, and even public sympathy. But the system she mocked had finally caught up. Inside the courtroom, Mags no longer had control. The same woman who had once shouted down politicians now sat silent while prosecutors detailed her crimes. To the public, it was the ultimate irony. The woman who had promised to protect children had been profiting from the very poison destroying them. Her downfall wasn't just about drugs or power, it was about exposure. The vigilante had become the villain. The defender of the people now branded their destroyer. For decades, she had built an empire on defiance, but in the end, it was her own pride that brought it crashing down. By the time the verdicts came, Big Mags Haney was no longer a symbol of rebellion. She was a warning, a reminder that even the loudest champions of justice can be hiding the darkest truths. By 2003, the mask had finally slipped. After years of rumors, raids, and headlines, Margaret Big Mags Haney stood before the High Court in Edinburgh, facing the full weight of her past. The evidence was no longer hearsay. It was hard proof. Lady Smith, the presiding judge, called her the mastermind behind a complex and profitable drug network that had poisoned her own community. The courtroom heard how Mags and her relatives had turned heroin into a family trade. The profits were staggering, thousands made each week, while she still claimed state benefits, living off the system she mocked. For years, she had played the part of the fearless matriarch, the voice of the working class. Now, every layer of that image was stripped away. The verdict was brutal. Her daughter, Diane, was sentenced to 9 years. Her niece, Rosie Ann, received 7. Her son, Hugh, 5. Each sentence carried the weight of years spent serving their mother's empire. Yet through it all, Mags sat motionless. No tears, no apology. When given the chance to speak, she didn't beg for mercy. She smiled and said the sheriffs should thank her for keeping them in work. Even in defeat, she refused to bow. But prison was different. It was the one place where no one called her Big Mags. Behind the walls, the power, the respect, the fear, all of it disappeared. She was just another inmate, stripped of her command and her reputation. The defiance faded as her health declined. Diagnosed with cancer, she was released on compassionate grounds in 2009, a shadow of the woman who once ruled Raploch with an iron fist. By the time she died in 2013, her empire had long crumbled. The streets that once echoed her name barely mentioned it anymore. For some, she was nothing more than a criminal who finally got what she deserved. For others, she remained a strange sort of legend, a woman who stood up to injustice but ended up embodying it. Margaret Haney's story didn't end with redemption or forgiveness. It ended as a warning. Power gained through fear eventually turns inward. And for Big Mags, the voice of the people became the silence of her downfall. Even years after her death, Margaret Big Mags Haney refuses to fade into silence. In 2025, the BBC podcast The Ballad of Big Mags reignited old debates that still divide Scotland. Was she the fearless grandmother who stood up for her community, or a ruthless dealer who destroyed it from within? Her granddaughter, Cassie, painted a conflicted picture. She spoke of a woman who could make you laugh one minute and terrify you the next. To the family, she was loyal, generous, and protective. But beneath that warmth lay a side only a few dared to confront. A woman who built her strength through fear, not love. Journalists and former detectives offered their own versions. Some believed Mags secretly passed information to the police, protecting her empire by turning on rivals. Others dismissed that entirely, saying she was simply smarter than everyone else. She played the system, the press, and the public all at once. Her story isn't just about one woman. It reflects a time when Britain itself was changing, when poverty, drugs, and media frenzy blurred the lines between right and wrong. Communities were desperate for justice, but also drawn to spectacle. Big Mags gave them both. In the end, she became a symbol of contradiction, a working-class icon who fought corruption but lived through it, a mother who claimed to defend her people while poisoning her own streets. Whether she's remembered as a hero or a criminal depends on who you ask, but one truth remains. Margaret Haney didn't just live in Britain's moral chaos, she embodied it. Margaret Big Mags Haney died at 70, and even in death, she refused to be defined by one story. To some, she was the woman who dared to speak for those forgotten by the system. To others, she was the architect of her community's downfall. Her life didn't just expose individual corruption, it exposed a society that created her, fed her, and then turned on her. She started as a voice for the powerless, shouting against drugs and injustice. But over time, her voice became part of the very noise she once condemned. The same hands that applauded her as a vigilante later pointed at her as the enemy. Her downfall wasn't sudden. It was the slow, inevitable collapse of someone who believed she could outsmart the same forces she despised. Today, her name carries a strange weight, part myth, part warning. She remains a symbol of moral collapse, of what happens when desperation replaces principle. Big Mags Haney was never just a criminal, nor a crusader. She was something far more uncomfortable to confront. A woman who fought evil while feeding it, who demanded justice while dealing in its absence. Her story ends not with redemption, but with reflection. A reminder that sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't crossed. It's erased.